at the moment. Just click the button. There's a feeling of deja vu a little bit about this. About 33 years ago, I was in Wigan for a series of meetings on Joshua, would you believe? And that's a long time ago now. So it's great to be back with you. I know I've seen you and been with you since then. And I believe that the purpose of tonight's ministry is just to kickstart a new study that you'll be doing yourselves on Joshua. I'd like to take our first reading, if you will, please, from the book of Exodus, chapter 17. So Exodus chapter 17. Verse 8. Now Amalek came and fought with Israel at Rephidim. And Moses said to Joshua, "Choose us some men and go out, fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the rod of God in my hand." So Joshua did as Moses said to him and fought with Amalek. And Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. So it was when Moses held up his hand that Israel prevailed, and when he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands became heavy, so they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. And Aaron and Hur supported his hands, one on one side and the other on the other side. And his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. So Joshua defeated Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. And the Lord said to Moses, "Write this for a memorial in the book and recount it in the hearing of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven." Moses built an altar and called its name, "The Lord is my banner." For he said, because the Lord has sworn, the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. Whenever Joshua comes under the focus of our Bible study, it's always interesting, I think, to look at his backstory, what we know about him before we reach the book of Joshua. We first meet Joshua in Exodus chapter 17. That's the place of our reading tonight. But that reference alone means that we can deduce that there were certain other experiences that Joshua must have gone through. For example, he must have endured slavery. That means Joshua is in the very first chapter of the book of Exodus. That must have been his experience. He must have experienced the plagues in Egypt that are recounted in chapters 7 to 10. He would have gone through all of that. He must have been involved in the Passover and the astonishing events of that night to be much remembered. And he must have stood amongst the people of Israel at the Red Sea, heard the directive of Moses to go forward. He would have seen the sea divided, and he would have crossed over on dry land, and he would have witnessed the return of the waters in judgment on the pursuing Egyptians. He'd surely heard the complaint of the people at Marah, and Joshua, I'm sure, would have tasted the bitter waters made sweet at Elim. At Marah, and then to Elim. He would have heard the further complaint against Moses. And I don't think it's pushing the picture too far to picture Joshua going out and gathering his portion or his family's portion of the divinely provided manna in the wilderness. And a third time in that short time frame, Joshua would have heard in his own ears the complaint of the people against Moses and the resultant striking of the rock at Rephidim and the water coming out. Now, all of those are incidents, events that took place prior to the first mention of his name in Exodus 17. But they're events of epic proportion, and I'm quite certain that they would have been deeply etched in the mind of Joshua. Why is this important? To go back into that background, I suggest that if we're to understand anything about the man of the book that carries his name, then we must always bear in mind that we're looking at a man whose experiences parallel our own. Now, what we mean by that is that Joshua had an experience that was the parallel of salvation. He had an experience that paralleled baptism. By that, I think principally baptism into the death of Christ. He experienced divine guidance and divine providence. And he was made aware of an implacable enemy of the people of God, against whom there would be constant warfare until God utterly blotted out the remembrance of Amalek. These were, say, deeply etched into Joshua's mind, his experience. And each of those things has a parallel in our own experience. So if we're going to learn of Joshua and lift out of the scriptures that speak of him and what he did, things for our own experience, we need to get this background settled first. So as believers in Christ, we've been redeemed from slavery to sin by Christ our Passover. We've been baptized into his death, the Red Sea crossing. We've been delivered from ever going back into bondage. This people you will not see ever again, the Lord said through Moses. We've been provided a sure guide, and daily provision has been made for us. And we are presently engaged in a constant warfare against the flesh until we're at home with the Lord. So each of those experiences that we've noted in Joshua's life are very real in our own experience. I haven't time to say anything more about them, and it's not our intention to do that tonight, but I do point you in the direction of Paul's great epistle to the Romans, chapters 6, 7, and 8, and you'll find that they run through such things, and they're great chapters to explore the glorious depths of our glorious salvation. What I do want to say, just suffice it to say, that the man that God called into the specific service that we read of in the book of Joshua had experienced matters that formed and shaped him into the man that he became. That's our first point. I want to say that when you get into the therefore of Romans 12, you remember Romans is set out as, this is Paul's modus operandi. He lays out the doctrine and then he makes application of it after the doctrine. It must always be that way around. We need to have an understanding of the doctrine, and then we understand how we're to apply it in our lives. So Paul's epistles are always laid out like that. And in Romans, the watershed comes at chapter 12, not that he wrote it in chapters, of course. But if you remember chapter 12, I beseech you therefore, by the mercies of God, that you present your body as a living sacrifice. What's the therefore? The therefore is on the basis of what I've been saying, the basis of the first 11 chapters, we would say, of Romans. And what I want to say to you is that if we're going to enter into the practical outworking of Paul's epistle to the Romans from 12 through to the end, 15, 16, then the degree to which we enter into that will be directly affected by the degree to which we've appreciated the doctrine of Romans 1 through 11. Now, that's our point about Joshua. The degree to which he became a successful servant of God, which you read about in the great exploits that he did in the book of Joshua, is firmly built, settled upon the experiences that he had before that. So it is with us. Joshua's background matters. That's my point. Joshua's background matters, and so does yours, so does mine. Our background is an important thing. Let's turn to our second point then, Exodus 24, if you just turn over to 24, verse 13. So Moses arose with his assistant Joshua, and Moses went up the mountain of God, and he said to the elders, wait here for us until we come back to you. Indeed, Aaron and Hur are with you. If any man has a difficulty, let him go to them. Then Moses went up into the mountain, and a cloud covered the mountain. The glory of the Lord rested on Mount Sinai. Verse 18. So Moses went into the midst of the cloud, went up into the mountain. Moses was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. Just turn over to chapter 32. Exodus 32, verse 15. And Moses turned and went down from the mountain. The 2 tablets of the testimony were in his hand. The tablets were written on both sides, on the one side and on the other they were written. Now the tablets were the work of God, and the writing was the writing of God engraved on the tablets. And when Joshua heard the noise of the people as they shouted, he said to Moses, "There is a noise of war in the camp." But he said, "It is not the noise of the shout of victory, nor the noise of the cry of defeat, but the sound of singing that I hear." So it was, as soon as he came near the camp, that he saw the calf and the dancing. So Moses' anger became hot, and he cast the tablets out of his hands and broke them at the foot of the mountain. Setting for this second point is Sinai. 75 men were allowed to touch the mountain that mustn't be touched. And 2 of them went on further up the mountain, Moses and Joshua. And after 6 days, Moses went on alone, leaving Joshua alone for over a month. It's an incredible thing, often missed, but Joshua was on Mount Sinai while Moses was further up into the summit of Mount Sinai receiving the testimony, the law from God. And Joshua waited. How he survived, we're not told. But the one impressive feature that comes out of putting those, Exodus 24 and 32 together, the one impressive feature that comes out of it is that Joshua clearly knew that Moses said, "We will return, I'll be back." And that was enough for Joshua. It was enough for having wait patiently. At the foot of the mountain, there's impatience. You know what happened there with the golden calf. But there's not a hint of any impatience with the man that was patiently waiting, the lonely vigil of Joshua. He simply waited, believing that if Moses said he would be back, then he would be back. I'm not suggesting for a moment that Moses is a type of Christ, but we can't help but see the deeper picture here, can't we? The greater thing. It's a foreshadowing of something that was even greater. A man has gone up into the glory, the Son of Man, the Son of God, returning to his throne. And he said he's coming back. And we, like Joshua, wait patiently, trusting in his word of promise, knowing that because he said it, he must be coming back. Notice the effect it had on Joshua. He's living in a different atmosphere to those who were engaged in idolatry at the foot of the mountain. Years ago, Celia and I were on holiday. Our children were very small at the time. It was a long, long time back. And we were on the island of Ibiza. And I don't know whether you know, but Ibiza has a sort of a mountain in the middle of it. And I was being told, I think, by Celia, we had to return the rental car because we were flying home the next day. So I had the responsibility of taking the rental car back. And I thought, I've got something like an hour here. I don't need that. We haven't been up this mountain. So I whizzed up the mountain to see what it was like. The reason I'm telling you that is I was amazed at the change in atmosphere. And a small island, just by elevation, there was a totally different atmosphere. Now with Joshua, it was a change of atmosphere of a different kind. He was removed, totally removed from the corruption that was going on at the foot of the mountain. I remember walking with Willie Stewart many years ago in our hometown at the time, and there was some very lewd graffiti on the side of one of the buildings. And Willie had not a clue what that meant. And I remember thinking at the time, there is a certain kind of naivety, which is sheer godliness. And that was Willie Stewart. There are some things that we're better off not knowing anything about at all. I know we need to know certain things in order to converse with people and urge them to flee for salvation and so on. But there are certain things that if they're out with our knowledge, then be grateful that that's the case. Joshua up on the mountain knew nothing of what was going on. I really like that thing when he's coming back with Moses and he says, sounds like war down there. He hadn't a clue what was happening at the bottom. And the more experienced Moses said, it doesn't sound like war, it sounds like singing. And of course, there was a big party going on down at the foot of the mountain. But the point we're making is our Joshua, he's removed from what's happening there. Ephesians 5:11 says, have no fellowship, Paul says, have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness. That's how we're to live. There's to be a distinct difference in us. We're living in the atmosphere of the mountain, the atmosphere of heaven, and it should affect the way in which we live our lives. It certainly did with Joshua. 1 John chapter 3, verse 3 speaks about our hope of the return of the Lord Jesus. And John says, he who has this hope set on him purifies himself as he is pure. So it has a purifying effect. You see, it's the opposite of corruption. And to live in the absolute anticipation of the Lord's return is a purifying thing. Joshua on the mountain, to me, exemplifies that in a fashion. They said of Horatio Bonar, one of the great pastors of early 19th century, was it? Horatio Bonar, they say when he closed his curtains at night, said, perhaps tonight, Lord. And he went to sleep. He got up in the morning and found that the Lord hadn't returned. So he opened his curtains and he said, perhaps today, Lord. It was 24-hour anticipation. The Lord could come at any moment. I was brought up that way, and I know many, if not all of you were too. And it's the way to live. Paul told the Thessalonians that they should live in that expectation of the Lord's return. So we should. There's a little rider to this point, by the way. Just turn over to the next chapter 33 and verse 11, if you've got your Bible open there. And it says, so the Lord spoke to Moses face to face as a man speaks to his friend, and he would return to the camp. But his servant Joshua, the son of Nun, a young man, did not depart from the tabernacle. The tabernacle there is not the tabernacle that we think of, it's the tent of Moses in this context. The tabernacle had yet to be constructed. But before it was, Moses took his tent and he pitched it outside the camp, and he would go there and God would appear to him. And this lovely expression, he would speak with Moses as a man speaks to his friend. So he revealed his will and purpose to Moses. And Joshua, our man Joshua, he must have been aware of that. And to him, that made that tent of Moses, that tabernacle, that tent, it made it a special place. Captivated and convicted by the revelation of God's being, his person, that God was making himself known. And Joshua didn't want to leave such a place. All these things are building up, aren't they? They're building up the person that we're looking at, the man Joshua. Now, let's fast forward to the next incident, Numbers 13 and 14. Now, I'm not going to read this because there's simply not time tonight, but it's probably familiar to you. And if not, you can read it. You have to get used to not saying you can read it when you get home, because on Zoom, everybody is at home. But you can read it at your leisure. But Numbers 13 and 14 is the passage that deals with the infamous treachery of Israel at Kadesh Barnea. You remember they were about to go into the land, and they sent in spies to spy out the land, 12 of them, one for each tribe. And as the old song has it, nearly anyway, 12 men went to spy out Canaan. 10 were bad, and two were Joshua and Caleb. That's the truth of it. 2 were good. And Joshua figures in Numbers 13 and 14 as a faithful servant in doing reconnoitering the land as he'd been sent to do, and coming back brimful of confidence in God. And you know what happened? The rest of the people didn't share his enthusiasm nor Caleb's. And they turned into a bunch of wailing unbelievers. Against that, Joshua and Caleb stand as men of integrity, men of honor, men of absolute conviction. And let it be said, men of great courage. Because the blubbering throng that day soon turned into a murderous mob. They were about to stone Joshua and Caleb and put them to death. But Joshua and Caleb stood their ground. These are men of absolute integrity, men of conviction, and men of courage. We mustn't pass on from this third point without commenting on the matter of faith, because it's wonderfully demonstrated for us here by Joshua and Caleb. Faith is not, as you know, a sort of version of Norman Vincent Peale's positive thinking theory. It's often portrayed that way, but it really is not. It's essentially different. Faith is God-centered. When you read Numbers 13 and 14, have a look at verses 6 to 9 of chapter 14 and hear the ring of conviction in Joshua and Caleb's voices as they speak to this murderous mob and all the people that were going down the road of this can't happen. And they speak with absolute conviction of what they had their trust in God. That's what faith is. It's God-centric. This whole picture here in Numbers 13 and 14 had to do with grasshoppers and giants and God. And the unbelievers, because that's what Hebrews calls them, by the way, the unbelievers never got past the grasshoppers and the giants. They saw themselves as grasshoppers. The people of the land were giants. This is never going to work. So that to them was the end of the matter. But Joshua and Caleb went a step further, from grasshoppers to giants to God. And to them, that sorted out the problem of the grasshoppers and the giants. So faith, we were saying, faith and trust go hand in hand. Faith is not insensitive to reality. Read what they say about it. They saw the giants as well. They didn't pretend they weren't there. Faith is not reckless nor indifferent. It recognized the issues. Faith looks the difficulty straight in the eye, fully aware of the threat and the danger, and then it looks to God and to his word. It leans on him and draws down strength from him. Faith meets opposition. Faith overcomes obstacles. It's not a pretending that they don't exist. It's a meeting of them and overcoming them. So our first point underlines the importance of foundational experiences in the ways of God. That's the salvation, baptism things. Our second point shows the importance of our response, patiently waiting in anticipation of the Lord's return, keeping ourselves free from contamination and corruption, and captivated and committed to the place where God is making himself known. And the third point is this matter of conviction leading to courage. And that's based firmly upon our belief that if God has said a thing, it will happen. And God is over all. Our God, if he's promised something, invites us to go and claim it and walk into it. It cancels fear. We said that Hebrews describes the failing of Israel here as unbelief. That's the seriousness of it. I remember having discussions with people at different times that you can be an unbelieving believer, believer in the sense of being saved, and yet you can still be unbelieving in the promises of God. And the letter to the Hebrews makes much of that, of course. Faith is the opposite of that. It's taking God at his word. Faith reaches out to God, lays hold of his promises, and it honors him by trusting his word. That's the third point. Now, there are other references to Joshua in Numbers and in Deuteronomy, Most of them have to do with the Lord's word to Moses concerning Joshua being his successor and of Joshua's inauguration into that. But I want to conclude with, I'll leave those for you to look at in your own time. But I just want to conclude with this. Let's turn to the book of Joshua, Joshua chapter 1. And this will just be our closing remarks. Joshua 1, we read the first 6 verses. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, it came to pass that the Lord spoke to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' assistant, saying, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now, therefore, arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, to the land which I'm giving to them, the children of Israel. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given you, as I said to Moses. From the wilderness and this Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites, and to the great sea toward the going down of the sun, shall be your territory. No man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you, nor forsake you. Be strong and of good courage, for to this people you shall divide as an inheritance the land which I swore to their fathers to give them. Our last point just rests on this, that if I could put it this way, the Lord does succession planning. In the Midlands district, we have quarterly oversight meetings, district oversight meetings, and on the agenda of those meetings, there is one item that's always there, and it's oversight succession. Now, meeting after meeting, we have nothing to say on that subject. There's nothing to bring from the various assemblies in the Midlands district. But some years ago, we decided to leave it on there. It must take a place on the agenda, because we must be men who are looking for the Lord providing for others to take the place of those he's taking home. I remember many years ago now, overhearing, it wasn't directed to me or at all, but I overheard Jack Ferguson speaking to somebody else. And he said to him, I've reached that time of life when one finds oneself looking over one's shoulder to see who's coming behind. It came as a bit of a shock to me when I realized that I was thinking about that one day, and I realized I was a lot older than Jack was when he said that. We do reach a time of life when we're looking for successors, people to take the place of our service. And it should be a constant with us. But my point is that God is into succession planning. He's never taken by surprise. So Elijah had an Elisha to follow him. The great apostle Paul had those choice men that he refers to in 2 Timothy chapter 4, amongst other places. And you can find lots of examples like that. Here's one of them. It's a classic. Moses had a Joshua, and Joshua was the Lord's man. At the beginning of this book of Joshua, we find the man who's been prepared by God. That's the point. And he's called into a specific service, but he's been prepared by God for it. And the service that he's been called into is huge. If we had time or we were deeper into the book of Joshua, there's a picture in chapter 5 that fascinates me, and Joshua goes out into the battlefield, or at least towards Jericho. And I just see him lonely, the lonely warrior commander. And perhaps I ought to be careful. I'm reading something into the text, and you should never really do that. But I just imagine Joshua thinking, oh, if only Moses was here. If only. I could imagine him thinking that. The responsibility that Joshua was called was immense. We've read it here in the first 6 chapters. The Lord gives it to him. It was to bring the people of God into their possession, to divide unto them the inheritance that God himself was giving them. What an honor. What a privilege, but what an awesome responsibility. And there's no way that Joshua could have done that had he not been prepared by God for that particular service. This opening word of the Lord to Joshua, Moses, my servant is dead. Moses' work was done. He'd gone to his rest, awaiting his reward. And Joshua is told to do what? To mourn? No, he says, arise, go over the Jordan. That's totally in keeping with what we've observed of Joshua up to this point. He's a man that's always ready to go forward, trusting. There's no talk of defection or defeat with Joshua, is there? Arise, go over the Jordan, take the people in. It's just in keeping with the man, but the man had been prepared by God. This is our closing point. I don't doubt, my brothers and sisters, that God has chosen you, each one of us. He's chosen us for some aspect or other of his service. And there's nothing that is more glorious in this life than that. We're in the service of the highest. Paul and Silas were despised by this world. But remember the girl, demon-possessed girl, called out after them, these men are servants of the Most High God. That was true. Daniel was, he rose to very great heights during the reign of Darius. But Daniel, anything he ever had in any of those kingdoms under the Babylonians or the Persians, never began to reach the levels of what he really was. He was a servant of the Most High God. So are you. So am I. We've been called into the service of the highest. And God equips us for the particular area of service that he gives to us, as he did Joshua. So at the end of the day, what is it? Is it pedigree or is it preparation? Some people rejoice in who they are. But it's not that with us, is it? It's not who we are, but it's what, by God's grace, we've become. We don't know the earliest experiences of Joshua, but we know what he went through from the slavery and so on that we recounted. But through all of those experiences, God was shaping his man, shaping his servant, forming him into the man that would divide the land as an inheritance that he was giving to the people. So I hope that helps to fill in some of the backdrop just a little bit. Helps us to see Joshua, the man who did a lot of very, very great things. But when all is said and done, they were things of God's doing, weren't they? Rather than simply Joshua. Acts 9 and 15, it's the Lord's word to Ananias, and he sends him to Saul of Tarsus. And I says, I've heard about this man, Lord. And the Lord says to him, you go, because he is a chosen instrument of mine. Isn't that wonderful? A chosen instrument of mine. You know, that applies to you and to me every bit as much as it applied to Saul, Paul, and every bit as much as it applied to Joshua. We are chosen instruments. And God does not use instruments that he hasn't prepared. So he's brought us through all these experiences, a recognition of our past slavery, a redemption from it, our deliverance from it, redemption out of it, our deliverance from it, the sheer impossibility of going back into it, because we're inheritors of eternal life, which began the moment we got saved. And all of these marvelous, marvelous blessings. And then the training, until he says, now, this is the thing I want you to do. Rise up, cross over, do it. Disciplined, trustworthy, dedicated. There are probably other words you could use of Joshua, but this is the man that when I open up his book, I'm thinking of. And God bless you in your studies, presumably of the book. But Chris, I think I'm through here.